Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for attending today's webinar. This webinar is devoted to talking about probation and parole supervision in the United States. There are currently over 6 million adults on some type of supervision. Averages out to 1 in 55. And when we can go to the grocery stores again and movie theaters and move away from our social distancing and isolation, you can expect that you will run into people who are on probation and parole supervision. This is an area that there are a lot of myths. This is an area that actually is very poorly understood as a policy area as well as practice. And so today we've invited two great experts, Dr. Brian Levin and Ms. Hania, to really discuss with us the situation regarding probation and parole. So the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, JCPA, is a national hub of local, national community relations networks that builds consensus on today's major issues. We work towards ensuring a fair and just America across diverse communities in our country. In 2016, we launched a criminal justice reform initiative to engage the Jewish community in criminal justice reform. And most recently, at our last conference in February, we passed a comprehensive policy resolution on restorative justice and rehabilitation. Through this work, we are very aware of the situation that's occurring around our country, and that, essentially, as we've learned, we're not set up to handle this public health crisis. We're not set up to handle a public health crisis regarding opioids and other types of substance abuse. And we know that there is a role for the Jewish community to play to improve our policy and practice. As we all know, as Jews, we care about the dignity of all people. We care about equity, and we care about fairness, which are critically important in our country. So just to kind of reframe a little bit, Jewish traditions are about how every human being has some value and dignity and worth, and how we should treat each other in the way we want to be treated ourselves. This is our way of being able to make a difference in the world, and it also is our way of giving back. The Torah mentions this obligation to love thy neighbor 36 times. For our Jewish community to fully live our values, we cannot hold ourselves at arm's length for people in need. Our work for justice must flow from the relationship with people who are vulnerable, who are disenfranchised, from listening to individuals, the stories they share, and from standing up for their needs. During this current pandemic that we're in, JCPA is not only amplifying and advocating for the needs of the Jewish community that are impacted from the pandemic, but also working with our partners on major concerns. So my name is Faye Taxman. I'm a professor at George Mason University, and I co-chair with Bruce Turnbull the JCPA Criminal Justice Initiative. We wanted to really have an opportunity to help inform you as advocates, as community leaders, as folks who are on the ground doing the hard work about some of the issues related to criminal justice reform. There are a lot of myths, there's a lot of misunderstanding, and we want to take this opportunity to give you an opportunity to hear from some experts in the field. So right now, as I indicated, we have 2 million people in prison and jails. We have over 6 million people on probation and parole. We know that, we are in a situation now where systems are changing to adapt to the pandemic. But we can also look at this as an opportunity to do some of the necessary reforms that are needed in the justice system. We incarcerate more people per capita than any other country in the world. We also overuse our community supervision to the point that we have people on supervision for longer periods of time, and this has a negative impact on people's lives. There are better and smarter ways of dealing with the problem of folks who aren't law-abiding and people who are in need. And that is something that we want to focus our attention on in this series of webinars. So today I invited two prominent folks to join us. The first one is Dr. Brian Levin. I've known Brian for a very long time. Brian is a principal for a great organization called Justice System Partners. Justice System Partners works with government, as state, local, and federal agencies, as well as nonprofit organizations on issues related to research and technical assistance to improve the quality of services that are offered. So Dr. Levin has a PhD in criminology from the University of Cincinnati. He's the current president-elect for the American Probation and Parole Association, hence one of the reasons we invited him today. And prior to Justice Systems Partner, Brian worked for the Harris County Community Supervision Agency in Texas as the assistant director. He's got a broad background from research to practice to technical assistance. He develops tools and interventions, and I'm really pleased that Brian was able to make it today. Our second guest this afternoon brings to us expertise in advocacy and reform. Erin Hania is with the Reform Alliance, and she spent 10 years as an attorney protecting the rights of indigent clients at all levels of our broken criminal justice system. She was a death penalty attorney. She worked with clients and witnesses to develop their social history and reframe the narrative for her clients around their lives in an effort to help the court better understand what punishment really means. I can't, I have to emphasize that being able to help people see individuals as individuals with dignity is critically important, and Erin has committed her life to helping those who are marginalized. And we need a lot of people like Erin, but she's here today to really talk about issues related to advocacy as it affects people in the community. So Brian is going to give us a general overview, talk about the importance of probation and parole, and then we're going to hear from Erin.
Great, thanks, Faye. I really appreciate it. And, I'm quite excited to be on this panel, not just because I have 3 kids and we're homeschooling and I get to avoid them for a couple of minutes, but really because it's an incredible opportunity to make a difference in our community. And I know that you guys in the organization have really done some great stuff across the country and have an incredible network that is really around purpose and around helping people, especially disadvantaged folks and marginalized folks, to have a better life. And I think for me, that's why I've joined this work and have done work over the last 25 years in this field, is to really improve the world that we live in and improve it for those folks that don't necessarily have the resources to be able to do that. So I really appreciate that, and thank you very much. So I'm going to give you a little bit of data in a PowerPoint here. I'm not going to bore you or put you to sleep with facts. I think sometimes data induces narcolepsy, but I really think that having some context to this conversation is incredibly important. And so as you see in this first slide around the size of the criminal justice system, Faye had talked about 6 million people under community corrections, and that's a staggering number, right? We have significantly more people under community corrections and in prison and parole than any other country across the nation, more so than China, more so than communities that call themselves not as free as ours, or ours being called more free than theirs. And so it's an incredibly difficult time to look at this. And what we see is that it really was born out of those late 70s and early 80s in an attempt to address really what's been now flagged as a misconception of violence. We had a large gang infestation, or what assumed to be a large gang infestation, with the selling of crack, cocaine. There were some early indicators that there was a violence associated with it. And so we started creating these draconian laws around incarcerating folks and being tougher on crime, assuming that more consequences and more severe consequences and deterrence types models were going to reduce and tide the stem of criminality. And so you can see from this slide that in the early 80s, we had less than 2 million, about 1.8 million people under some sort of community supervision. And sitting today, we're a little lower than this slide, but not much. We're at about 6.8 million people. And so we're talking about a 4-time increase in the number of people under community supervision, be it in parole, probation, prisons, or jails. And so, and these aren't like proportionally true. These don't match the proportion of folks in our communities. People of color, Black and brown folks, have seen the brunt of this, but so have women. There's been an incredible increase, about 700% fold increase in women going to jail and prisons than in the early 1980s. And predominantly driven by an industry of drugs and a culture of drug use, and our approach being one of punishment and not of treatment. And so if you see the next slide here, one of the big concerns that we've got is that 50% of the people that end up on supervision, so about 4.6 million people, probation or parole. And let me take a step back real quick, and let's talk about what that looks like. And so I think often we get this idea that probation's a slap on the wrist, and that if we just incarcerated more people, we would see this significant reduction in futures of crime. And there's actually some really good research now that shows that prisons have basically zero net effect on people's chances of reoffending. That we send people to prison, they get out, and the reoffense rates are relatively similar to what they were if they never went to prison. And really what's interesting is, back in the early 90s, we started talking about no frills prisons and reducing the number of resources in prisons and minimizing the number of social services and treatment programs and education services, and we canceled Pell Grants for folks that are incarcerated. And what we found was that prisons that actually took those approaches, the people that got out reoffended at 6% higher rate than those folks who went to a normal prison, if you will. And so they actually got worse in those environments, not better. And the way I think about it is this. You take someone who's struggling or not struggling, right, but was engaged in some sort of level of crime, and you put them in a box for 6 years, and you provide no services and no connection to the outside, and you minimize the amount of time they're engaging with pro-social people. At that point in time, they're not going to get better. They're going to get back out, and there's going to be significant barriers. So probation is an attempt to not force people into an incarcerated event, but to give them opportunities to either A, self-correct on the front end, or B, receive services that are effective in changing their behavior. Too often we see probation, or people see probation as this kind of nicer, softer way of addressing behavior. But the truth is there's a ton of people who end up on supervision who fail. And fail not just for the reasons that we would expect, where they continue to engage in crime, and do things that hurt or risk the community, but they actually fail on technical violations. They fail on rule violations. And so there's a history on probation about judges being able to order or sentence people to a set of conditions. And so while you're on probation, you get a set of rules you must live by. Probation's role generally has been to enforce those rules over the years and to ensure compliance to those rules. Now, there's not a lot of standards around that. Most states have a lot of discretion. Most judges have an incredible amount of discretion of what they can order and what they can ask folks to do. Some are in good faith and are designed to be reform-oriented or rehabilitation, community safety, kind of focused, and others are just things that people do. So, for example, I know a judge who ordered someone to wear a sign on a street corner, telling them that they drove drunk for 2 weeks straight for 8 hours a day, right? The assumption being that we're going to shame this person into not drinking and driving. The reality is this person had a drinking problem. They didn't have a shame problem. They weren't embarrassed or not embarrassed at work. They had an issue with drinking, and wearing a sign wasn't going to fix that. It actually increased the likelihood, because to cope with the fact that he had to wear a sign every day, he went home and drank. And so we've got this misconception, I think, of probation and parole and what its role is and how it actually succeeds. So about 50% of the folks do not successfully complete probation. These numbers are really loose as you get into this work and as you see probation, parole, community corrections has not been the best of collecting data. It is not one of the high kind of priorities of the system. And so data systems are quite reserved and quite kind of archaic to the larger world. One of the interesting things, and you can see on this next slide, is we rely on punishment for an incredible amount of interventions in our world, if you will, or ways to get people better. Actually, as we talked about just a couple of minutes ago, punishment hasn't shown to be very effective in changing behavior. And there's a good reason for that. Most of our folks, it's not about motivation. It's not about getting up in the morning and saying, you know what, I'm motivated to go rob someone, I'm motivated to steal, I'm motivated to do X, I'm motivated to get drunk and high, or I'm motivated not to. For most of the people that are served in community corrections, especially those that are moderate to high risk, which moderate to high risk folks are people that have pretty significant gaps or in their skill sets or their opportunities. Most of the people lack the skills to be successful and to navigate their world in a way that keeps them out of trouble. And the way I think about this is this: if I asked you to speak French fluently and you had to the end of this presentation, and so Aaron's going to speak after me, and then we'll come back and answer your questions. By the end of this presentation, you need to speak French fluently. And if you're not, you're going to receive a punishment, a consequence. You're going to go to jail for a day. And at the end of that jail sentence, if you're not speaking French fluently, you're going to go for 2 days, and then 4 days, and 8 days. Our system is somewhat designed to be a deterrent-based system. We threaten a consequence, and we assume that people are going to follow the rules. Well, the reality is, if you don't have the skills to speak French fluently, it doesn't matter what the punishment is. You're not going to be able to avoid the punishment because you can't do the intervention. And what we believe is there's a host of folks on supervision who can self-correct. They have the skills to do that. And so you can see on this next slide what those risk factors are, or what those skills are. They have the skills to navigate their peers successfully, to obtain employment that's enriching and that's that's beneficial to their life and can meet their level of need and their family's needs. They don't have substance abuse problems. They have good problem-solving skills. They have a strong family core, education. They have a decent background in education, right? These are the things that keep low-risk folks, or folks that engage in crime but can self-correct. These are the things that keep them penetrating the system deeper and deeper. But for many of ours, we would argue about 40 to 60% of the folks that are on community supervision today, those that are moderate to high risk, have really big gaps in these. And that it's not about punishment, but it's actually about teaching and supporting and growing and coaching people into a different lifestyle. And so we approach the work historically, or at least in the last 30 years, less around rehabilitation and more around how do we punish and surveil people to be better. And what happens is it ends up resulting in a bunch of failure. If you look at the right side of the screen, we've got blocked opportunities and collateral consequences. We've got where people are blocked from re-entering society successfully. So we look at things like criminal history. You can see the list on the collateral consequences list here on a couple slides forward. There's 400. There's been some studies around. One more slide, if you don't mind, please. There's been some studies around collateral consequences. This concept that you receive a punishment, but there's these secondary kind of outcomes that come along with punishment or come along with engagement in the criminal justice system. There's studies now that show that there's about 3,600, 4,000 collateral consequences. Earlier studies showed around 400 collateral consequences. People are blocked with employment. They're blocked with occupational licensing, where they can live, what social service kind of connections they can get. They're blocked with political participation, the ability to vote. I don't know if you followed the news, but you know, there's a lot of states now that are advocating for people that have been justice involved to be able to retain their rights of voting post conviction or post adjudication. There's poll taxes that go along with that. And so there's a ton of ways that we block people. Once you engage in crime, driver's license is the perfect example, right? And so many things in our community have been attached to a driver's license, and the assumption is if we tell people they're going to lose their license if they don't engage in X, Y, and Z, of course they're going to then do pro-social stuff so they don't lose their license because they know that that's a means to an end. And what happens is they don't have the skills to be successful, so they fail. They lose their license. They can't afford it. We've added surcharge after surcharge and hoop after hoop to jump through. And then people just can't get their license. So then they drive without a license. And then they get picked up and they get a driving with a suspended license or invalid license. They get put in jail, which most people don't realize you can actually go to jail for, you know, a period of time for in most communities for driving without a license or a suspended license. They get a fine, they get a surcharge, more money, and it becomes this vicious cycle of no way out. And so we understand that in probation, we've got to rethink how this works and how that looks. And so if you look at this next slide, we start to think about you know, probation from a different perspective. Instead of having rules and conditions that limit what people do, we really have to think about how we improve people's lives and how we build opportunities. And so this is a typical traditional condition set. People have to be sober, they have to be employed, they've got to follow the rules from day one. So if you look at a calendar, as soon as they get put on community supervision, they're expected to follow what's done. But it leads, if you could slide a couple forward, please, it leads to failure, right? It leads to people feeling like they are a failure. Keep going. One more. There. And so it leads to people feeling like they're a failure, that they have no route forward, and so people give up. And one of the #1 predictors of failure on probation is running, is absconding, is stop attending, because if you can't fix yourself and you can't figure out how to get through the system, people just end up giving up. And so I want to talk a minute about what are some options and what are some things that that we can think differently about. And so if you can scroll all the way to the last slide, if you don't mind. Yep, that one. And so while we can think about the world and what we've got to think of, right? So here's what I would challenge us to think about as you work in your local communities and your state kind of connections and the federal, you know, the national kind of piece. The first one is we have to think about how we improve measurements of change and helping people recognize, you know, that are on community supervision, how they're getting better, and helping the community recognize that probation and parole are actually opportunities for folks, for those folks that do need it to improve their lives and stay out of an incarcerated event. We also have to better define how we measure success and failure. Historically, probation and parole is measured it by the number of people they revoked as a good thing, and that they were taking people that were breaking rules off the street. The third way is to really think about ways to integrate back into society successfully. I think organizations that are grassroots organizations and advocacy can really think about how they can help reduce the collateral consequences and improve the connections back into the community and find ways to help people maintain and actually re-engage or engage for the first time back into the communities. We need to significantly reduce the number of people on supervision so that we can have the resources that are necessary to serve those that are. And we have to do a better job of community substance abuse programming. Most folks that end up on supervision have tried to go through treatment in the communities and failed. And there's not a lot of technology there. There's not a lot of good expertise. There's a lot of folks in that arena that have lived experience and are trying their best to improve people's lives, but we got to do a better job of blocking them from getting into the criminal justice system, because once they get there, it really is a quick pipeline to prisons and to jails.
Well, thank you, Brian, for giving us a crash course on community supervision, and also an understanding that our current practices are really harmful for people, and there is an urgent need not only to shrink the size of the probation and parole supervision population, but also to change practices to help people become successful, and also to provide better opportunities for individuals to improve the quality of their lives. So I'm going to turn it over right now to Erin. Erin is going to discuss from a reform perspective, her perspective on probation and parole supervision. So Erin, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I first just want to say, anytime I get a chance to hear Dr. Levin speak is a great day for me. He is just an incredible expert, and also really a wonderful advocate on this stuff. So I'm honored to be able to speak at this, but I'm also just really enjoying listening to Dr. Levin's as well. So I am the National Policy Director for Reform Alliance. And as we've already talked about a little bit, there are 2.3 million people who are behind bars. And luckily, we now have had many discussions, and it's become sort of a part of the general awareness in our culture that there is a mass incarceration problem. And so we've started to hear much more about what we can do to work on that specifically. And so while working on that issue and speaking with many folks who were involved with those reforms, it became very apparent to us that while many people are aware of the 2.3 million people who are behind bars, a lot of us don't realize that there's this much larger group even of over 6 million people who are under some form of correctional control. And these are our neighbors, they are often our family members, but because it's not something that we talk about or that there's a ton of awareness about, we often don't have it come up in our daily conversations. And so Reform Alliance formed specifically to look at conditions of probation and parole, to look at consequences of probation and parole, and to figure out ways where we could make a difference in terms of reforming some of the more negative practices and some of the more negative consequences. I think one of the most amazing things about working in the probation and parole space, as you all have likely gathered from just hearing Dr. Levin's, is that oftentimes when we come into advocacy spaces, there's sort of a clearly defined opponent or adversary. And really in the probation and parole space, one of the things that we've learned very quickly is that most people in fact want the same thing. So most of the folks that we work with who are under supervision, so who are on parole or probation, and most of the probation or parole officers that we work with all want the same thing. They all want people to succeed under supervision. They all want resources to go to the people who need it the most and to not be wasted on people who are already doing okay. They all want to have a system that works, that reduces recidivism instead of sort of furthers or exacerbates it. So as Dr. Levin's talked about, there are a number of people who fail under supervision, when supervision in its ideal form is set up to help prevent that. And of course, you're never going to prevent all of that, But in its ideal form, it is meant, as Dr. Levins was discussing, to be more of a supportive. I love his when he talks about being a coach. You know, to have more of a system where if there are people who are struggling, who do not have the tools to make it and to be on track, the idea is that the supervision system has sort of a net that is going to help catch them and help encourage them to get back on track. And so one of the wonderful things about working in this area is the fact that we all do agree on so many things, on ways to make the system better. I think that one of the biggest areas for reform, and one of the things that I'm going to encourage folks to get involved in, has to do with technical violations and what Dr. Levins was just talking about in terms of us having a system that is often more punitive than it is rehabilitative. So one of the questions that I think we get quite a bit is, well, if everybody for the most part wants the same thing when we talk about probation and parole, which is we want people to succeed, we want it to be supportive, why is it still happening that we are having so many people unable to succeed, so many people ending back up in prison and in jail as a result of being under supervision? And I think the main reason we have this, right, is that currently supervision exists in part of this continuum of our criminal justice system. And for many, many decades, we have had a system that conflates this idea of punishment with the idea of justice. And so for a very long time, our understanding is that more justice for someone generally means more punishment for the perpetrator or the wrongdoer. And I think it has been pretty recently where we've started to disentangle that. And as Dr. Levins pointed out, we've started to really, get into the data in terms of understanding that solely relying on punishment and negative consequences is not a model that has been particularly successful in any arena. And certainly not in our criminal justice system. And so a lot of the reforms that Reform Alliance advocates for and that looks at in states are ways to help encourage lawmakers to allow probation and parole officers the freedom and discretion to use as many positive reward systems as they have negative ones. So that the idea is that we are shifting, shifting a system so that it is not solely reliant on punishment, but so that we do have enough room for positive reinforcement. And I want to talk just sort of briefly about what those consequences look like when we talk about the negative reinforcement and the negative consequences for somebody on parole or probation. Dr. Levins talked about technical violations. So again, these are if you violate the set of conditions that a judge may prescribe as part of your supervision sentence. So if you are, for example, this is something that is very relevant right now with the corona pandemic, if you are required to meet in person with your probation officer, let's say once a month, and you miss those meetings, you may be in a jurisdiction and you may have a probation officer who would classify that as a technical violation. And with a technical violation, you can actually end up back in jail or back in prison. And so we were talking about giving people time behind bars for a crime or for a non-crime, right? So not because they committed a new offense, but because they did something that was against a condition of probation or parole. And this can be incredibly hard for people on a very, very basic logistics level. If you are required as a condition of parole or probation to have a job, but you are also required to show up at your probation officer's office in the middle of the day without any notice if they want to drug test you, those are two things that are often going to conflict and be problematic. when I'm at my job, it's very unusual for me to be able to leave in the middle of the day without any notice and have to go somewhere to report there and to have to potentially wait there for as long as necessary in order to comply with those conditions. So that's one of the basic ways that that's become a problem. There are also, you know, collateral consequences. Dr. Levin's talked about anywhere from 400 to 6,000 collateral consequences. One of the stories that we hear from people who are under supervision who have had to be reincarcerated for a technical violation are the horrors that can come with that. There is a woman who we've worked with in Pennsylvania who was pregnant when she was reincarcerated on a technical violation. So again, she did not commit a new crime, but she did not comply with the conditions of her probation, and she was put back into jail. And she went into labor early and had her baby in jail. And this stemmed again from this technical violation. Now that we are in the era of Corona and we are all learning how to change our behaviors based on the COVID pandemic, there is unfortunately another consequence that can come from reincarceration due to technical violations of supervision, and that is quite literally death. We had an incident just over this past weekend where there was an individual who's 53 years old. He had been incarcerated in Rikers for about a month due to a technical violation. And he was the first person in Rikers, the first incarcerated person in Rikers to pass away from COVID. So again, this is somebody who was there as a result of a technical violation due to not complying with conditions of supervision. So these are lots of different examples of ways in which most of us agree that there can be reasonable limits on, you know, probation and parole conditions, and that we can really free up probation and parole officers to focus on folks who need the most help. And what we can do now, since I know there are so many people at home who are ready to be activated, who want to do something about this, Reform Alliance has a number of ways that folks can get involved. If you go to reformalliance.com, you can look at ways that we work in different states around sort of what I'll call normal times, probation and parole reform, but also really specifically how we are addressing probation and parole reform in the era of the COVID crisis, and how we are working with governments, whether it's the federal government or whether it's individual state governments, to look at how people are being treated behind bars. So Reform Alliance worked with a number of experts and came up with the Safer Communities Plan, which you can find on our website. The idea there is that safer prisons means safer communities. It is a list of steps that we are asking governors to take, that we are asking the president to take, that we are asking the Department of Justice to take, to keep people behind bars safe, but also to keep people who are currently under supervision safe. So if you are in the community and you are under supervision and you are being told that the best thing to do is to social distance and not leave your home, but you are wondering how that's going to affect your compliance with probation and supervision conditions, we are asking governors to make that clear to people and to make sure that they are being allowed to be safe and to abide by CDC protocols first and foremost, so that they can save their lives and the lives of those around them. So please go to reformalliance.com, look at the SAFER plan. You can sign up to contact your governor. You can sign up to contact Department of Justice. There are a number of things that you can do, and we really, really urge you to get involved. This is a matter of life or death right now.
Thank you very much, Erin, and we really appreciate some of the guidance of what we can do now, and also, you know, the fact that people can go to your website to find out other activities that they can do. So, you know, and I want to thank the audience, because we have about 5 or 6 questions already, which is pretty cool. But I also want to give everyone a homework assignment. So one of the things that I've learned over the years is that we often don't think that probation, which has a probation officer assigned to someone and a number of conditions, is onerous. So my homework assignment to you is to write down up to 20 to 25 conditions on how you can live your life. And then it's sort of like New Year resolutions, right? But you're going to do 20 of them. And the reason I picked 20 is because that's the average number of conditions that people have in this country. And see how long you can remain in compliance. So these could be things like making sure that you set your alarm and you get out of bed when it rings, making sure that, you know, you pack your lunch and you're, you know, not running around when we could run around, going out and buying lunch. And so I think it's important to really see what it's like to have all of this hanging over us as a way of really trying to understand, what does this mean to be on probation? People think that it is easy, but in fact, you know, as Brian and Aaron pointed out to us, you know, the consequences are high. And in fact, there's a couple studies out there that have basically shown that people, about a third of folks, when they're sentenced, would prefer to go to prison or jail because it's more certain than to be in, you know, on probation or parole when they're not sure what of their behavior is going to be tagged. Okay, so that's your homework assignment. So I have a question here. One of the biggest problems for probation and parolees is fines and cost of their supervision. And yes, this person is correct. In many states, people have to pay monthly fees to be on supervision. Many times these costs are inflated by private companies. Can Aaron or Brian, would you like to respond to you know, this question about the financial burden of being on probation?
Sure, I can jump in first. I'm sure Dr. Levin has a lot to say about it as well. You know, the fines and fees that go with probation are one of the most difficult and onerous parts of being under supervision. Oftentimes people have to choose between whether to pay their supervision fine and pay for basic needs for their family. And again, because the threat for not paying fines and fees in some jurisdictions can be reincarceration, that can become a really, really impossible choice for people. I just spoke with somebody last week in Florida who is at home now with his son because of Corona. So he is not working and his son is not in school. And he was getting messages while we were on the phone from his probation officer saying, if you don't come in and make your payments this week, I am going to violate you. And he had no idea what to do. He was saying, look, I really can't leave the house. I would be leaving my son alone. And I'm not working. I don't have the money. It's dinner for my son or it's paying these fines and fees. So a lot of the reform that we have focused on doing in conjunction with a lot of probation and parole officers who have been incredibly supportive of this type of reform is getting counties, getting states, getting governments to say, you know what? We are not going to charge those types of fines and fees. And at the very least, even if we can't get there, we are not going to allow the inability to pay to be a reason to violate someone.
Yeah, no, Aaron, you're right on. I think the piece is that in the early 70s and 80s, when we cut rehabilitation programs and people wanted to be tougher, they started charging fees and fines. And right, there's this belief that if you have you know, if you have skin in the game, if you have $1 in, that you're going to be more committed to it. The problem is that's true with people that have wealth and discretionary incomes. But when you have to choose between feeding your family or paying a fee that isn't even attached to treatment, right? That's a tough call. And so I think that's a piece of it. I think where we can be advocates on this is twofold, right? Probation departments have too many people And, but most probation departments their budget comes from the proportion of people that are on supervision. And so it's this catch-22. You reduce the population, the money goes down as well. And so they're relying on fees to provide services and to provide interventions. And so one of the places that has done an incredible job at the juvenile level that we really could use as a kind of a marker for future policies is Ohio did Reclaim Ohio, which was a reinvestment project over 20 years where what would happen was juvenile justice judges would send kids to prison to get treatment because their local jurisdictions didn't have treatment, didn't have money to pay for it. And so they sent them to prison in hopes to help them get better. Well, we showed them by data that the kids weren't getting better in prison. They weren't getting any better treatment or any treatment at all in the state institution. And so they started to transition budgets, and they were able to close. They went from 13 prisons down to 6, down to 3. No girls are in prison in Ohio any longer. There's only 3 facilities for boys, and they reinvested that money back into the community. And one of the things that we've seen in this kind of reinvestment piece is really this benefit of being able to transition or transform from probation fees to state budgets. The problem is generally we don't see that trickle down, right? So in policy in Texas, we see closed prisons and closed state jails, but the probation fees haven't, the money to provide services to probation hasn't gone up, and the burden is still on the justice involved individual for user fees.
Okay, thank you. So the next question that is raised here has to do with the coronavirus. And how has, the virus and the need for us to all remain socially distant and stay at home, how does that affect people on probation and parole? What's happening with those 6 million people in terms of making sure that they fulfill the conditions of their supervision, but they're also not placed in jeopardy? And then a related question from the same person, which is a good one, is what can we learn from this period of time that could help us in the reform of probation and parole services? So who would like to begin?
I'll start. So as being president-elect for APPA, American Probation and Parole Association, we're in constant contact with agencies across the country on how to manage and how to transition and transform their organizations. To be honest, it's like every other thing in our country. There is no single system. There is no common core thing, right? So every 3,000 probation departments can do it 3,000 different ways. There's some really good places that have transitioned completely to online, to webcams, to call-in lines, to providing supervision or providing support services, right? This isn't just following conditions. This is about how do you protect people and care about them in a time where we're all struggling, right? And so I think the agencies that have done that and been able to transition that have done well. I hate to say it, there are agencies that are still making people report in person. There are people that are making agents or probation officers sit in the office, or making justice involved people, exposed not only to the staff, but also to each other. And so it can vary broadly across spectrums. I would say the one lesson learned is, and I think it's a pretty interesting one, is that we have been incredibly resistant to support any technology that isn't surveillance, right? Our field has adopted all sorts of technology on how to surveil people and watch them closer, but not necessarily how to advocate and help for them. And what we've seen is much more breakdown of the traditional, you have to come to my office. It's like telemed for us, right? Like, we're all so used to going to see a doctor until we're like, oh shit, now we got to be in a waiting room with other people that have sickness. And now telemed's the best thing in the world. I can get on a video chat with a doctor in 12 minutes instead of waiting for 2 weeks. And the same thing I think is going to start with probation and parole, is that we're going to start recognizing we can break down a lot of barriers by technology.
Yeah, I'll just add, thanks. I'll just add, I think a lot of it goes back to Faye, what you were saying in the beginning about recognizing and respecting human dignity. And this is always a challenge when we talk about the criminal justice system. It's a challenge when we talk about people behind bars and when we talk about people under supervision. So I think one of the things that we've been working really hard to do, and organizations like Reform Alliance and Cut 50 have been working really hard to do, is to make sure that we are remembering that the people who are behind bars and who are under supervision, they are grandparents, they are parents, they are children, they have loved ones. And just as it's very difficult for all of us right now to be away from our loved ones, it's not only difficult for them, it's also extremely dangerous. And so being able to partner with people like Dr. Levin's, with, I know Commissioner Nail in Georgia always does a wonderful job. And so being able to look to probation officers and parole officers who are saying, look, I want to recognize the importance of keeping people safe and recognizing sort of the dignity of their humanity, the difficulty of what we're all going through, and I'm going to amend my normal practices to make sure that they can stay safe. That's been huge for people. And I think, again, just as what Dr. Levin said in terms of what we can learn, I think we may learn that some of this stuff works well. We may learn some of it doesn't work so well, and that's important to know too. But for right now, at least on balance, it seems pretty clear that with the public health emergency, we're going to have to change some of the way that we do this.
Hey, can I jump in real quick? I think there is
Sure.
a piece of this that's really important as well, is that there are a group of people who really need our help. It's not just being physically connected or monitoring supervision conditions. I mean, there are people who have serious drug problems that are on supervision, people that have, some violence issues that we're trying to help navigate and manage and build new skills. And so in the effort of not engaging people into physical space, we also have to transition our treatment services to be telemed and to be online and to still give people the support they need, right? It's less about supervision, making sure they're not going X, Y, and Z or following this condition. It's really more about how do we engage people and help them be successful during this time.
Yeah, and because the justice system has such a large concentration of people with serious substance use disorders and mental illness, as much as we all are so affected by the social distancing, people who have, some sort of behavioral health issue also are even more at risk for relapse, for having, continued functionality issues. And the officers, and systems, need to be there to support. So, the COVID puts a lot of those folks at risk, and that adds to additional stress for individuals and their families. So we actually have a question from a substance abuse provider who also is a lobbyist in his or her state, and this person indicates that they notice that when people are released from prison or jail, they need detox and treatment. And in fact, the statistics are that someone who's released with a substance abuse problem from prison is 14 times more likely to die of an overdose in the first 2 weeks than the general population. So this is a huge issue. And this individual indicates that they struggle to really deal with drug abuse within the institution. And they also struggle with trying to get support to expand treatment services within the institution during the release stage and when people are on supervision. So any thoughts on what we can do? I think, Brian, you mentioned earlier that, we need to expand quality treatment services. But what are some of the other things that we should be thinking about in this area, and how do we build support with our government officials, lobbyists, states, legislatures, county legislatures on this issue?
Yeah. It's a hard balance, right? Because if you think about treatment in jails, what happens is that every local community who puts treatment in jails, the jail becomes the treatment facility. It becomes the largest treatment facility in that place because they know they can hold them. They know that they're a secure setting, and everyone's worried about them overdosing. And so you get sentenced to jail. And I can tell you, I've been in many jails and many prisons, and those are not environments designed for treatment. They're environments designed to hold and put people into custody. And so I think it's a tricky balance. I think, you know, there's some really good evidence now around some of the medically assisted treatments. They're pretty resistant in jails in most places. There are still lots of probation departments that are resistant in using them, and they're incredibly expensive. And so I think making sure from a lobby perspective and a support perspective that your communities are using the most, you know, up-to-date, effective practices around, you know, especially around opiate use, making sure that sheriffs understand the risks, investing. I was just in a rural area in Indiana and looking at a jail feasibility study, and they were looking at going from a 65 or 70 bed jail to 280 bed jail, investing $50 million to grow their jail 3 times because rural environments or rural communities are getting killed by opiate use and by meth, and they don't know what to do. And basically I said, look, I talked to every stakeholder in your community, not every, but right, a majority of stakeholders in the criminal justice system. And everyone wants a treatment program. And you're trying to expand the jail to be a treatment program. And what I told them was invest the $30 million and build a treatment program. Like, you don't need it in the jail. Put it outside the jail where people can get better services. They can integrate into the community. Non-justice involved people can get treatment as well as justice involved. And so I think that's a big push, is that we've got to stop using our jails as treatment facilities for people with mental health issues, behavioral health issues, or substance.
Erin, do you want to add, or should I move on to the next question?
I'll just quickly add, you know, I think this is sort of, it applies to substance abuse programs, but also to a lot of sort of reentry programming that really has to start before people leave the facility. If you look at something, for example, like the First Step Act, right, which was the federal criminal justice reform, a lot of the detailed sort of provisions that went in there that I think, you know, were not as publicized or as discussed, but a lot of that really looked at programming that can happen inside while fully recognizing that inside is never the ideal place to do it, as Dr. Levins was just saying, but also really setting people up with what we call sort of a warm handoff, right? So that they have an understanding of what the services are as soon as they're coming out. They may have met with their supervision officer before they get out. They have a plan in place. They know where they're going. So really encouraging the legislatures or, you know, even at the county level, right? Board of Supervisors, whatever it is, to really make sure that they are doing some of that planning and supporting the supervision officers and helping with that transition. So far, at least the data on that has been hugely encouraging, that when you have that warm handoff, when you have that in place, it's much more likely that people will succeed. And now in the time of COVID, because I know that was part of the question, doing it with technology is going to become more and more important.
I think the one thing to remember too is that not everyone that leaves jail is on supervision, right? I mean, depending on the jurisdiction, but you know, in Harris County, 40% to 60% of the people that leave jail just had a jail sentence, right? And so they don't have a probation officer, they don't have a parole officer, they don't know where to go, they're not connected to services. And so even if you're in an environment where there are good probation departments that are trying to transition folks, they walk out of jail at midnight and that's it. And so I think we've got to also think about, from a community perspective, how do we wrap around services to people that aren't on supervision but exposed to jail as well?
All right, well, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. To our audience, we appreciate it. One of the last questions basically is the reason we did this webinar. So that question basically stems from the notion that, you know, the criminal justice system needs changing. We know that. what's keeping us from doing this. And I would say the reason we wanted to do this webinar on probation and parole, and we thank our two guests enormously for their time this afternoon and giving us their words of wisdom, is because there are a lot of myths about being on probation and parole. There's a lot of perception that it's just a slap on the wrist and easygoing. But in fact, this is the pathway to criminal justice involvement, is, recycling through the system. So we encourage you as stakeholders from JPCA to really get involved in your community. JPCA will be sending out a reform sheet on prisons and jails after this, and we are working on one for probation and parole. So you will get that in a couple weeks. And we thank you for your time. In about 2 weeks, we will continue our series when we discuss pretrial and the importance of reform at the front of the criminal justice system. So I'd like to really thank Brian Levin and Erin Hania for their time this afternoon. And like I said, their wisdom that they've shared with us, and we appreciate it very much. Thank you. Have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.